Afternoon. Welcome to the Gilbert Library. My name is Dr. Aisha Johnson, and I happily serve as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Outreach. Welcome to A Space for Me, a history and vision for the future of women in STEM, of course, hosted here in our Price Gilbert Library in the Scholars Event Network. Scholars Event Theater. A special welcome and plenty of gratitude to the author of The Exceptions and Pulitzer Prize award-winning author, journalist Kate Zernike. It was Kate who broke the story of the 16 female scientists who forced MIT to publicly admit to years of discriminatory practice against female faculty. Well, academia is a place of challenges as we seek, of course, to educate everyone, the masses, while we also strive to overcome our own historical practices that were not equal or fair to a variety of people. So we encourage equity. So for example, women make up 50% of most undergraduate classes, but only here at Georgia Tech, there's 40%. While Georgia Tech has made great strides towards equity and equality, we're not still there. We still have work to do. We're not alone in this journey of correcting such practices, but we seek to be an example and a leader in changing these practices through conversations like this. So at the center of this conversation, naturally, is the library. We indeed are what I consider the heart of the schoolhouse, the soul of the institution. So why not lead the way and have the platform for such conversations? We seek to provide exceptional service for faculty, staff, and students. And since we service everyone, conversations based in equality and fairness also belong here in the library. So, welcome to today's program, Conversations with Kate, and our very own Sharitha Dantes, which will be followed by community conversations and refreshments upstairs on the second floor. Thank you for attending, your engagement in building this community. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to go up. Yeah. You go.
She's going the wrong direction.
Try to figure out our choreography here. We're good?
Okay. All right. Am I on? Can you guys hear me? I don't think. Oh, there we go. There I am.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for that wonderful introduction and for setting the tone for the event today. Good evening to everyone who was able to attend in person. My name again is Sharitha Dantes, and I'm the Senior Business Analyst here in the library and also a proud alum of Georgia Tech. I am so excited to see everyone here, and I'm also very excited to have Kate Zernike with us here this evening. Once again, she is the national correspondent for the New York Times and the book author for our discussion today, The Exceptions, Nancy Hopkins, MIT, and the Fight for Women in Science. Welcome, Kate, and welcome you all.
Thank you so much.
All right, well, we're gonna just go ahead and jump right in. So, Kate, tell us, give us a synopsis. Tell us about the book, and also talk a little bit about why you decided to call it The Exceptions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I just want to say a little personal connection is that when I started researching this book, of course, I was, needed the MIT archives, and so it was Alex McGee, who's now the university archivist here, who helped me at MIT. So I feel like there's some personal and MIT connection here, so I'm really grateful to be here. Yeah. This book is, as Dr. Johnson said, I first broke this story when I was a reporter for the Boston Globe in 1999. And I had started covering higher education about 6 months earlier in September of 1998. And my father, who was a physicist, had said to me, you might want to look into the work this woman named Millie Dresselhaus at MIT is doing to get more women into physics. And I was like, ignored him, partly because kids ignore their parents, but also I just thought there were lots of programs to do good things for women, and I'd written about some of them, and it just didn't seem that dynamic or exciting. But 6 months later, I had that kernel in my head when I got a tip from someone else in the newsroom who said, there's something going on with women and discrimination at MIT. And they told me to call this woman named Nancy Hopkins. So I called, and she told me that, in fact, MIT was going to admit discrimination against women, which in 1999 was really striking. Like, I think when I called, I thought, oh, there'll be a lawsuit. It'll be he said, she said. So this was really striking. The second thing she said was that the reason MIT was admitting this was that these women had gotten together and gathered data to prove their case. So some of the numbers that we were seeing before the program started, that was the kind of thing they were looking at. How many, what percentage of grants women got? What percentage of their salaries women had to pay out of, women versus men had to pay out of their federal grants, and what percentage that MIT covered? How much lab space they had, that was a big one. What kind of courses they taught. So that was really striking to me, and just struck me as a very MIT and science thing to do. Like, these women had they'd sort of leaned into their science to make their case on the equity question. So that was really interesting. And then the other thing was that they were talking about a very different kind of discrimination, right? That it wasn't, yes, part of it was lower salaries, less lab space, but it was also, at the time, that it was a new phrase at the time, unconscious bias, right? Like, it was discrimination that you couldn't see, and it took them a long time to recognize that it was discrimination because, as they said, it didn't look like what they thought discrimination was. My sort of version of discrimination at the time was shaped by my mother, who had graduated from college in 1954 and wanted to go to law school, and was told, you'll never get a job, so she didn't go to law school. So she went to business school, but she had to go to the girls' version of the Harvard Business School, which was the Radcliffe program in business administration. And so it was my idea was like, oh, discrimination is when the door is closed to someone, right? But my mother had gone to law school in the 70s, so it was like, oh, doors are open now. What these women taught me was that, in fact, discrimination had just shifted, right? And it was the stuff that had gone largely underground. It was that it's not just enough to open doors. You have to think about how you treat people and how you view them as they work their way through their careers. And in particular, it was a problem for older women, right? So it was the women who were just starting their careers got lots of grant money and lots of support, but then as they stayed on and became more peers of the men who were in charge, they were no longer the women that the men looked at and thought, oh, she could be my daughter. It was like, she could be my wife, So they were talking about a different kind of discrimination. So 2 reasons to call the book The Exceptions. Well, let me just talk about why I went back to the book now. I think at the time we weren't talking about unconscious bias, and so it was really a new concept. In 2018, when I started thinking about this book, I think we had become so used to the idea of unconscious bias that people didn't hear it anymore. And they really thought, like, I've cured that, or I had the workplace training on that, I don't have that anymore. And so I wanted to write this story about what these women experienced so that people could understand what it's like to go through this day by day, year by year. To the extent, as with Nancy's case, like, it took her 20 years to realize she was being discriminated against because it didn't look like what she thought it was going to be. So The Exceptions refers to 2 things. And it was just because when I started writing this book, I had no idea what I was going to title it. But I kept, when I was reading and going back in the archives and reading histories of women, I kept stumbling over the word except. She was the exception. Oh, she's exceptional. She's doing this amazing thing, but she's exceptional. And it was like, oh, wait a minute, there's a lot of like, there's supposed to be only one exceptional person, right? There's lots of them. So that was one thing, that these women were exceptional in that they got jobs at a time when women in science weren't getting jobs. They were exceptionally talented, exceptionally accomplished. But the other reason relates to this idea of unconscious bias, which is that these women kept saying, when they would describe what happened to them as they worked their way through their careers, they would say, yeah, but I didn't think it was discrimination because I thought it was just this one guy, or I thought it was just this personality conflict, or I was just in a bad situation for some reason, but it was the exception. And I remember there's actually a moment I was on tape with a woman named Penny Chisholm, who's a marine biologist who's now she's a National Medal of Science winner. She discovered something called Prochlorococcus, which is the smallest, most abundant photosynthetic organism in the ocean. And it's really cool because it's like a black box for climate change, and you can look at its genetics and understand how the planet is changing. Very cool. Anyway, so I was on tape with her, and I said, I'm thinking of calling the book The Exceptions. She's like, oh. So gradually we came around to this idea.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that.
Of course.
Very intriguing, of course. You talk about data.
Yeah.
So let's dig into that a little bit. Tell us about the power of data to empower Nancy Hopkins and her colleagues
Yep.
when they were going through this.
Yeah, so the book starts with Nancy in 1963 when she's a junior at Radcliffe. But a decade later, in 1973, she becomes one of the first women to be hired at MIT. It's the dawn of affirmative action, and so several of these women who ultimately formed this group of 16 were hired around that time. And so the first things that happened to her aren't really data related. It's like she's the only woman, as she said, she was in the cancer center at MIT, and there were more Nobel Prize winners than there were female faculty at the time. That's how striking it was. She was the only one of the first ones hired. And so it was like the UPS guy thought that she was the secretary, so had her sign for the packages. The technicians thought that she was a technician, so treated her like one. The postdocs thought she was another postdoc, so they would take her cells, not realizing that she'd really put months into developing them and growing them. So again, nothing she could quantify. What ultimately happens 20 years later is, or not quite, about 17 years later, she goes into a new field. First, she says, she thinks, okay, it's just the 5th floor that I'm having trouble with, so I'm going to move off the 5th floor, I'm going to go to the 3rd floor. Then she discovers that this guy outside of MIT is taking credit for her work. He's going around giving speeches, taking credit for something she discovered. So she's like, okay, maybe it's cancer, and she's going to leave cancer. So she starts a new field, and she goes into a field, developmental biology, that's largely led by women. And she thinks, okay, maybe this will be better, and she's going to do this little experiment. It turns out it's not better, and this is where the data comes in, and she's finally convinced by the data. Because when she gets hired as an affirmative action hire, she knows that she's an affirmative action hire, but she also doesn't worry about it because she thinks science is a meritocracy, it's all about data, it's all about numbers, it's all about how hard you work, and if I do that, I'll be fine, I'll win a Nobel Prize. But in the late 80s, she switches to developmental biology, and she's working in zebrafish. She's one of the first people to use zebrafish as a model organism in this country. And she needs more space for her fish tanks. And she asks the head of the cancer center for more space, and he's like, we don't have space. And she's like, but I know there's space over there, and it's going to this guy. And she's like, all the other men in the building have more space than I do. And he's like, don't be ridiculous. But he kind of gives her an idea. He's like, I'm sure if I measured, I'll measure my space and let you know. And he doesn't, of course, but she thinks, well, I could do that. So she takes her tape measure. She goes around the building late at night, and she measures every lab and every office space and figures out that not only does she's fully tenured, she has less lab space than all the men, but she even has less lab space than some of the men without tenure. So that's her first piece of data. The next piece of data is that she's asked to develop and teach a course. It was the first time MIT was going to require biology for its undergraduates. At the time, I think the only required courses were calculus, chemistry, and physics. So this was like a real recognition that biology had kind of arrived. Everybody needed to know something about genetics, so every undergraduate was going to have to take this. They asked Nancy to develop this course. It's a really big deal. She's teaching it with another man, a younger man. 3 years in, that guy says that he wants to teach with another man, so there are going to be 2 men teaching it. And Nancy can't figure this out because the course is getting good ratings, she's getting good ratings, and the guy who's going to replace her, there's no difference between them in the ratings. And finally she realizes, oh, it's not actually me. It's that these 2 guys want to teach together, and they're going to start a company, and they're going to commercialize the course. They're going to write a textbook and develop CD-ROMs and teaching videos. And she's sort of again, it's the data. It's that what proves to her that this is not about her personally is that she was getting really good ratings. So that's when she goes to see one other woman, and then they reach out to what they think are going to be all the other women at MIT, and they think God, there are going to be so many, we can't possibly talk to all of them, so we'll just talk to the women in the School of Science. And they go and that's when they figure out that there are 15 women with tenure in the School of Science and 197 men. So this is 1994. So again, that's the data point, right? So it's all this data, now they're being bombarded by data, but they've also got these stories of how they've been pushed aside. So they go to the other women and ask them if they want to sign on. And the data is really, the course is what convinces the other women to sign on. But what they're really interested in doing is, as you say, looking at the data and making their case. So everybody measures their lab space. They look at what percentage of salaries the women are paying out of their own grants versus the men, the kinds of courses they're teaching. One really interesting statistic or data point to me was the percentage of the percentage of outside activities, so teaching courses or serving on committees or journal review boards, and whether who was getting paid for it. And it was mostly the men who were doing compensated outside work, whereas women were uncompensated. So the data was very important, but it was not the only thing, right? I mean, these women, ultimately they were a group of 16 women because they pulled in 2 women from the School of Engineering, and so they had a pool of 17 and all but 1 signed on. So they wanted to be as scientific about it, but they also knew that that's not much of a sample size. So they also interviewed all the women and got their stories. So it was really, when it came to convincing the men to get on board, it really was a combination of data and stories that made the difference. But I think, Nancy's tape measure, it's now in the MIT Museum, and it really became a symbol for other women. This story went viral. So I reported the story on the front page of the Boston Globe on March 21st of 1999. The next day, the dean of science shows up, who had been an ally to all these women, shows up to his office, and the CBS Evening News is outside his office. Nancy arrives in her office, the phone is ringing, and it continues ringing for 2 weeks, but she picks up and they're like, hello, you're on the phone in Australia. So really people and then the New York Times put it on their front page. So I always say, as much as anything could go viral in 1999, this went viral. But what people talked about was the tape measure, partly because it was the lead of my story, but it was also I think a lot of women were trying to concretize or put a value on how they were feeling, and the idea of stretching out a tape measure and being able to measure it really gave them power.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, here in the library, we're, leaning into the data as well to tell stories.
Yep. And it's very powerful, the numbers you show.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's switch gears just a little bit. So I want to let you know that Georgia Tech has not had a first-year class with more than 150 Black women students. Can you talk briefly about the intersection of race and gender in STEM?
Yeah. The numbers here do not look good. It's interesting. I'm going to start a little bit earlier than maybe what you asked, but in the beginning, the idea about how we were going to diversify STEM with the question of women, but also with underrepresented minorities, the idea was we're just going to increase the pool of undergraduates. That was the model, right? And the idea was if you fill the pipeline organically, we will have more faculty. And that, again, was a real that's what people realized from this study that these women put out at MIT. There were 2 graphs in there that were really interesting. One was what they called the pancake graph, and it was the percentage of women hired since 1973 when they really started, and it was totally flat between 1973 and 1994. The other graph, though, really put the lie to this idea that maybe women, or in this case, underrepresented minorities, were not interested, because at the undergraduate level, several departments actually had more women than men. And that was sort of true, a little less true, but still true in some cases with the graduate students. PhD level, postdoc, and then junior faculty and faculty, it completely drops off, and that's when the percentage of men went up. But when they were when they were trying to get more female students in the early 70s, they really looked at the work that a very active Black Students Union at MIT had done, led by Shirley Ann Jackson, who was the president, went on to have a very successful career as the president of RPI. She was the second woman in the United States to get Black woman in the United States to get a PhD in physics, and the first Black woman from MIT. And she tells this wonderful story about she was going out to look at, she hated MIT. It was really miserable. She'd be studying there, and she would sit down at a table of white women, and they would get up and walk away. I mean, it's horrible stories. So she was like, I'm out of here. And she goes, and I think she was visiting Penn to do her graduate degree, and on the way back, she hears on the radio that Martin Luther King has been killed. And she was like, nope, I have to stay and make the situation better, which I thought was really powerful. So she does, and she starts this Black Students Union. And what's interesting is that the women learn from the Black Students Union. That they see, what the Black Students Union did was they sent people out to majority Black high schools and said, come to MIT, this is a place for you. So the women started doing that. But after that point, when it comes to faculty, the women really were leading on this. And I think they had more luck getting getting white female faculty than they did black women. So when this group gets together in 1994, there's not a single black woman. And it's still not much better. There was, in the mid-'70s, there was a study by a woman named Shirley Malcolm, who, gosh, I can't remember, she also went to MIT. But she is now at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And the study was called the double bind, and that's what they referred to. So what Shirley did was she collected women from different groups of minorities, and it was small enough that it was about 30 women. And they met in suburban Virginia, or rural Virginia, actually, and for like 3 days and talked about the unique problems facing women from different minority groups. And the double bind was this idea of being particularly black and female in science, because the groups for black students were primarily for men, and the groups for female students were primarily for white students. So it's like this was no woman's land for them. And I think that's still the case. And I think that's where you do hit up against, it's a matter of representation and also this sort of attitudes. Like, I think the biggest hurdle right now is the intellectual hurdle of people look and they say, well, women aren't, that person doesn't belong in science because they haven't traditionally been here. And so, the woman feels that double bind of having to prove herself doubly. And if you're a black woman, black and a woman, it's like, I'm sure the expectations just feel enormous to you. So it's been, that has been really the hardest problem.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Well, you were saying, though, the numbers, we were talking about the percentage, you were saying it's like...
Yeah, so when I was doing the graphs for the slide deck, we did have African American in there, and it's flat. It's flat, and it's very low.
You wouldn't have noticed it was so low.
Yeah, it was very low. I mean, it looked like one of the grid lines.
Yeah.
Because it was very straight, no movement at all. Even though women have moved, African American women have not in the same regard. So it's very, it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah.
So we've done some data analysis, and based on current trends, like you saw on the slide, the projected year in which female faculty of all categories and statuses will equal male faculty at Georgia Tech in 2064. What can we do collectively to speed that up? And what role do our male colleagues have in that progress?
Yeah, I always say that it's obviously there are things that women can do. I'm always getting questions from women in the audience, like, what can I do? And it's like, well, there's someone else in this. And the role of men was really important to the women at MIT. So the first thing that they did was talk to the dean of science. So Nancy finally gets so frustrated with this course being taken away from her that she writes a letter to the president, and that's when she kind of gets cold feet, and she shows it to another woman, and that's when they get the idea to survey a bunch of women. But they ultimately decide they're going to go talk to the dean of science, who's a man. And again, they've spent like 6 weeks writing him this letter, and they want to change his mind. And of course, they send the letter, and they're very nervous about it. They assume like he's gone out and hired lawyers, and he's like alerted the president's office. And they show up in his office, and like he hasn't even read the letter. He doesn't know it's arrived. He's like, what are they doing here? And so he's sitting in a conference room with 6 of the 16 women. And what really moves the needle for him is that one after the other, they tell a different version of the same story. And he said to me, if I had seen any one of these women individually, I would have written it off as, the one-off, right, the exception. But hearing them one after the other, he was like, oh my God, we have a problem. And he's a physicist, and he described it like it was as powerful to him as the most powerful of his scientific epiphanies. He describes solving this 100-year-old physics problem, and he was driving on I-95 going north, and it was like he was so excited by solving this. He just suddenly like eureka, that he had to pull off the turnpike and call his go to a payphone and call his collaborator and be like, I got it. And that was as powerful. Like when he saw these, he was like, oh my God, we have a problem with women. And so he becomes an ally to them, and all they wanted was a committee to look at the numbers. They didn't even, they weren't even going to produce a report. They were like, whatever. So he says, okay, you can have the committee, but then the men push back because they weren't sure what this was going to look like. they thought this was like women having a revolution, and what does this mean for me? And I think it does put people, I think that's the first hurdle, is to, unfortunately, you have to make people feel like this isn't going to be threatening to you. But what they did, some of the women in this group of 16 said, we need a committee of women to do this. And other women and the dean said, no. You got to have men involved here for two reasons. One, and it's got to be powerful men, so Nobel Prize winners, department heads. Partly because you need to signal to other people, and particularly other men, that this committee has power. And also, they know where the bodies are buried, but they also know how to get you things. So like the women had no idea, for instance, that when they wanted to compare grant money, there was something called the Brown Book, and you could go look up what grants were available, who was getting what grants, what labs got what percentage of their funding from grants. And so it was just a matter of like figuring the system out. But I do think it was signaling to other people, other men, that this was important. And that's something you have to that's a good reason to include men. The other thing they did was one of the younger women said that they should, of the men they put on this committee, they picked the guy who was the biggest skeptic, because they thought if we can turn his mind. First of all, she knew that once they turned his mind, he would be a real advocate for them, that he would fight for them. And she said, then the other men will see oh, if Tom's on board, we can all be on board. So I think the allies were really important. And then, of course, the most critical ally was the president of MIT, Chuck Vest, who looked at these numbers and heard these stories and was convinced and signed on. And he put a very powerful, one more person was very important. Again, another Nobel Prize winner, a guy named Jerry Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991 for discovering the quark. And Jerry was so bowled over, as I said, there had been no plan to write a report. He was so bowled over by what they were finding that he was like, Nancy, you have to write this down so that the dean can see this and that he can fix these problems. So they decided they're going to write it down. And that ultimately becomes the report that goes out. But the president sees this report and talks to these women, and he is so impressed by what he sees, or so moved by what he sees, that he writes this preface to the report. And in it, he has this line that is quoted in every story that's then written about this. And the line was, I'm probably not going to get it perfectly, but it's, I have long believed that gender discrimination in universities is part perception and part reality. True, but I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of the balance. And that, by far the greater part of the balance, was again, eureka. We got it. The president of, I'm not going to say it here because I'm at Georgia Tech, this very prestigious institution of science and technology has said, this is a problem. And to have Chuck Vest signing on, that's what everyone quoted, and that's why it rippled out that's why it went viral, because all these other universities could say, look, if MIT says it, it must be true. There had been all of these reports on the status of women at other universities. Just the previous year, Johns Hopkins, Harvard had been producing reports on the status of women faculty for years, repeatedly, right in the trash. Nobody was listening until the men spoke up, which is unfortunate that it has to take that. But I think we have to, you have to go to war with the army you have, right?
Absolutely.
So I think the role of male allies is important. But you also asked about what we can do to get more women. So a couple things. The women, when they did their report, half of these women did not have children. So you couldn't look at this group and say, oh, well, the reason, another usual excuse, the reason there's no women in academia or math and science is because they work really long hours and women can't work long hours because they're raising children. These women had made a conscious decision not to have kids, to devote themselves to their careers. But when they had done this report and it goes viral and they get all this attention, MIT said, what do we need to do to fix this now? And they went to the junior faculty women, and they all said daycare. So they put daycare on it. They extended the tenure clock. They made it normal for people to take. Nobody had ever taken maternity leave because there was such a stigma to it, so they made it normal. I can't remember exactly how they did it, but I think they gave everyone an automatic leave, so you didn't have to choose to take it. But there are also, if you look at MIT today, huge progress on women. Female board chair, female president, female dean of science, female chancellor, female provost, on and on. Woman heading the director of research, and she's also one of President Biden's science advisors. All three are women. So real progress. In the School of Engineering, 8 departments, 5 are led by women. So for engineering, that's huge. What the dean of engineering did after this report in Science, engineering did a similar report. And he just refused to put up, I was telling you earlier, he refused to put up with the usual practice was, well, we tried to find a woman, but we couldn't find, but we did the search, did a nationwide search, and we just ended up with these 5 guys, and this one guy we found is perfect, and there's nobody else who's better than him. He was like, no, don't do that. Bring me if you're going to bring me a search, it better have women in it. And I think you can do that with the pool that you're looking for. There are people out there. This idea that there's nobody qualified is, Mitt Romney was made fun of when he talked about binders full of women, but you can make binders full of women. You can ask your female faculty, which is how it was done with men for years. Who do you know out there? Who's promising? So I think there are concrete things you can do.
Absolutely.
So
thank you so much. So we're going to see if there's any questions in the audience.
we can also.
Excuse me.
Anybody? I can also just keep talking all night. No, I'm kidding.
Absolutely.
I was going to say one more thing one more concrete thing that's interesting is Nancy has now moved, Nancy Hopkins, who's the hero of this book, this is very much a collaborative story, but the first 2/3 of the book is about Nancy, just to give you this personal example. And there's a woman who is about my age, but she's at MIT, and she's an institute professor there now, who considers Nancy a mentor, Sangeeta Basha. She's a bioengineer, I believe. And she and Nancy and Susan Hockfield, who's the first female president of MIT, got very interested in women in biotech and what you can do to increase the numbers there. And the numbers there, it's like black women on your slide. It's very low. Biotech has been good for women in that if you're working in biotech, maybe you have more flexible hours than you might have if you're running your own lab in academia. But when you look at who's leading biotech firms, it's very much, founding biotech firms and serving on scientific advisory boards, it's very much male-dominated. And this is partly because venture capital firms are so much male-dominated. But what these 3 women have done, just using the Boston biotech world, which is pretty big, as their sort of starting point, their hub, is they did a study on biotech firms, faculty founding biotech firms out of MIT and Stanford, and they found that female faculty are disproportionate. It's most often men who are starting these firms, and that's because these venture capitalists will go to them and say, "Here's some money. What do you want to do?" What they did in Boston was they got venture capital firms to agree that within 2 years they will not fund companies that do not have at least 25% women among their leadership. So again, there are targets you can set and give to people as goals. I think that's something else you can do.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh.
Hello. Yeah.
Hi.
So with these efforts to increase numbers of women in all these fields, how do you deal with the assumptions that the women who got where they got is not entirely because of merit?
Not entirely because of merit?
Because of their merit, but because of all these efforts that are being taken.
So in other words, that people are accused of being affirmative action hires? Is that what you mean? That people say you're just getting the job because of...
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's really not... I'm not saying this to you, but this is. I think you're right that this is the common assumption, is that we're going to water down the standards, right? That is a canard in this whole debate, particularly about affirmative action. When MIT first started admitting women, not first started, but MIT will tell you it's always been co-ed, but there weren't they kind of fought to keep the women out. So when they first started to increase their numbers, really trying to increase their numbers, they decided they were going to have 25% women because that's what they could handle in the dorms. So if you go from and everyone said, oh, but they're watering down the standard. But no, because if you only have 25% of your slots for women and 75% for men, more men can get in. Therefore, you are willing to accept a lower quality of man to fill those slots. It's not that you're dropping the quality for women when you admit more, it's that you're raising the standard for men. And so that's one argument. But also, if you look at the 16 women that I write about, 4 of them are now National Medal of Science winners. 11 of them are members of the National Academy of Sciences. It kind of just doesn't, and when you look at, I have at the back of the book, the book's there, sorry, this listing of who these women are, and it's huge developments. I told you about Penny, but Joanne Stubbe, chemotherapy medicine, developing chemotherapy medicines, and all these, Marsh McNutt, who is now the president of the National Academy of Sciences. Like, these are not, they're no slouches here. And when you have a place like MIT, you're not going to thrive if you're not hugely successful. I think so I don't think it's true, either for students or for female faculty, that you do water down the standards. In fact, I think oftentimes it's actually harder. And there have been many, many studies over the last decades about who applies for jobs. And, same resume, the man is much more likely to think, oh, I could do that job, whereas the woman's like, oh, I don't know if I'm prepared or not. In fact, what men talk about and what the Dean of Science talked about was he couldn't get women to apply for these jobs running departments. He had to convince them, which is another thing that you can do, is just reach out and I think that's an acceptable form of action. If you know there's a woman who you'd like to run the department, maybe you need to ask her, what would it take to get you to do this job? The former executive editor of the New York Times, where I work, was the first black executive editor, and he said, when he had a pool that didn't include women, he would just go out and think about who do I want to talk to, who do I want to see in this job, and go out and say exactly that. Like, why don't you apply? I think asking someone to apply is not necessarily a huge advantage. I think where this is a disadvantage is in the assumptions for those groups, which that they are constantly, it's the hint, like, oh, well, I know why you're here. Like, there's still one guy in Nancy's department at MIT. She's been retired for 9 years now. One guy who still told me, well, she only got into the National Academy of Sciences because of all this women's work. And, the National Academy of Sciences doesn't really work that way. I don't think, but the bias is still there. Well, it's just because you're doing this women's work. So I think it's actually, the real battle is like inside maybe your own head. Yeah. I mean, I think, so there's the external, like, there is me bringing that assumption to you, but there's also me having that assumption in my own head of like, do I really belong here? And I always say it's really unfortunate that, like, I think the idea of imposter syndrome is interesting, but I also think it's a way of like, well, because it's often used to describe women, or pathologize them, and it's like, well, you made me feel not welcome, so no wonder I don't feel welcome. No wonder I feel like I don't belong here. So I think it's a lot of self-talk, and it's about how you speak to yourself, and that's part of it. I think that when I started out reporting the book, I think I thought that the idea of numbers and representation was maybe overvalued, and it didn't really matter. But now I actually think numbers are really important, and I think the more that we can increase numbers, the more that people say, oh, I belong here. So I think numbers are hugely important. But given the internal hurdles that women and minorities face to apply for these jobs, I think it's rare. I think it's the exception when someone is given a job and they're not qualified. So. Up here. Oh, hi.
Thank you for talking about the challenges of turning your powerful skeptics, because those are the people that you need to be your biggest advocates.
Yep.
So thank you for that. You mentioned how the women of MIT followed Shirley, who created the
Shirley Ann Jackson.
Jackson, who created the Black Student Union, and it really is a mirror of the Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Rights Movement, where the Women's Rights Movement pretty much piggybacks off that of the Civil Rights Movement. But we also know what we call hood feminism that left Black women behind in the work of feminism. Did you see any of that in your research? While a number of white women were able to band together and progress, though following this model that Jackson sets up, did you see allyship there or division?
So when Shirley Ann Jackson, the women who followed Shirley Ann Jackson's model were undergraduate women who were saying, okay, we want to increase the number of female students. It was not the group of 16 that I write about in the book, but the group of 16 that I write about in the book, I mean, there were times when I was like, why am I writing about this group of white women? Like, it is, exactly to your point, like, is this sort of the same old problem? They were really working with what they had. There were no black women in the School of Science. There was not a single black woman in the School of Science. Just to be a woman in the School of Science, like, again, 15 women, 197 men. So I don't think they were particularly excluding black women. It was just that there were none. where I like to see this idea of groups learning from one another is when, the women of the School of Science did this report. It goes viral. So then MIT says, we're going to do this. We're going to join together with 8 other universities and have them do it, 8 other prominent schools. But we're also going to do the same study, the data study, at the other schools at MIT. There are 5 schools total. And when they did that, so they did that first, and then the second thing they did was try to institutionalize this idea of diversity. So I know now, like, everyone has these huge diversity DEI departments, right? There wasn't one at the time. So the president said to Nancy, I'm going to make you the head of a diversity council, and I'm going to elevate you to what's called the academic council. So it's the highest board of, it's like the provost, the chancellor, the president, the sort of highest ranking people at MIT. And Nancy, to her credit, said, like, great, diversity council, but it can't just be me, white woman. Like, this has to, like, we cannot talk about, women is not going to solve the diversity problem. We have to talk about particularly black students, right? Or black faculty members, but that was the most underrepresented group on campus. And so they made them, it was a co-chair, so it was a black man and Nancy trying to do this. But I think actually, again, that kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about the double bind, right? Like the groups, it's just, there's a group of women who are left in no woman's land, which I think is hard. But I'm really glad that you brought that up about civil rights and the women's movement, because I was thinking about this. We walked by on the way here this exhibit about Title IX, which of course opened doors to women. And I'm going to forget, Bunny Sandler, I think was her name. Yeah, Bunny Sandler, who's the godmother, called the godmother of Title IX. And she was a white woman. And she tells this great story. She was trying to get a job. She was teaching as like, I think an adjunct or something at one of the schools. I think it was University of Maryland. But, and she went for a full-time position. And they said, well, they basically said, like, the first guy said, like, you're too difficult or something. And the second guy said, like, well, you're just a housewife who went back to school. She had a PhD at the time. But anyway, but what she did, she was upset, and her husband was the one who said to her, this is discrimination. This is sex discrimination. And what she did was she then looked up, she read a lot about the tactics of the civil rights movement and how because this was in the early 70s, how they had gone about it. So I do think, like, everybody's learning from each other. I guess I wish that they could also work together, and that there would be more collaboration, because it's not enough to just. But yeah, I don't know what you do about the larger problem, because the numbers are so slow there. It's embarrassing. And I think it's self-reinforcing. I think one of the things I've talked about a lot. I've been walking, touring, talking about this book for about a month, and I talk a lot about how people say, why is this still a problem? And there are many reasons, but one thing that I'm really interested in is just the language that we have around science and intellect. And there have been studies that, when we talk about genius, we tend to think of men. When we talk about scientists, we tend to think of men. When we talk about women, and we do more often talk about women in terms of their personality, but we will talk about women, well, if they succeed, it's because they worked really hard, right? It's not because she's a genius. But that's men and women who think that alike. And we also think that physics and math require a particular kind of raw brilliance or genius. And so the effect of that is that women, and I would say particularly women from minority groups who are not, they're not represented in that space, look at those fields and think, well, you have to be a genius, and I'm not a genius, so I'm not going to go into that. So it's a lot of the way we talk about this, the way we talk about people who are in these fields. And I think, the answer is not necessarily, it's great if we go around calling people geniuses, but it's also, I think we also have to change our understanding of what science involves, right? Like, science is, I think we're now coming to recognition that science is largely about collaboration. And this old model of, like, the lone wolf genius is maybe a little outdated as well. It's sort of as outdated as the white guy with the pocket protector, So, yeah.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us.
Of course.
I've found this really enlightening as a discussion piece.
It's so nice to see a man in the audience.
So I'm actually in kind of in a unique position. I'm the editor-in-chief of the campus newspaper
Oh,
here
great.
at Technique. So I'm really happy to be here to hear from you.
Congratulations.
Specifically. Thank you. We've been doing a lot of women-related reporting throughout the month of March. We had our Women's History Month issue that's been on the stands since before spring break.
Oh, great.
Where we try to highlight and focus on women and their achievements throughout. So my question is, like we've done a lot of looking at the numbers and doing deep dives into data when it comes to admissions standings,
Yep.
admissions numbers, as well as graduation numbers. And so I saw a statistic up there about how that number of women graduated from tech is like fairly plateauing or slightly increasing, I think, towards the end of it to the modern day. I don't know, it reminded me of this post that Georgia Tech made on International Women's Day, where they claimed that since 2009, Georgia Tech has been proud to graduate more women engineers than any other institution in the United States. And like the two numbers
Right.
there don't really seem to add up. And so
Yeah.
like from your perspective, like how do you feel about institutions like bragging on this statistic, I guess, while still maintaining kind of, the same old policy?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you look at the numbers, so two things on the numbers, and I'll speak to Georgia Tech in a second, but at MIT, right? Like, okay, so there were 8% women on the faculty in 1994, and then they went up to 20%, and it's still like somewhere in the mid-20s. It's not, it's not anywhere close to the representation in these fields among certainly nowhere near among undergraduates, women in those fields. And also, as much as I talked about the women in leadership now when you look at the PhD level, the attrition rate is higher for women, so they're dropping out at a higher percentage. And when you talk to those women about why they're dropping out, it is this old perception of who belongs here and who doesn't. When girls don't do science, or like if you mess up, it's double fault on you. Whereas men are like, oh, he's just young, he'll learn. So I think, yes, like. As it happened, I had a friend who was here with her son for Admitted Students Day, and they were over at, I think it was, I can't remember, mechanical engineering, I think she said, and yeah, you saw it. And she was saying, so she's very involved in tech, she was at Google, she was actually the chief technology officer for the United States, and she was saying that, 30% of the students are women, but she was actually impressed by that number of graduates more women. So her feeling was, they're trying, right? So I think it does matter. Like when you look at the attrition rate, that's a problem. You have to think about who stays, and are you making them feel welcome? Are you supporting them? So I actually think that the percentage of women graduating might be, I won't say it's the more relevant statistic, but I think it's a hopeful statistic, and I don't think it's irrelevant, certainly. I think it's worth looking at both numbers. But here's the thing, I think everyone thinks there's part of the thing, I guess, why are you writing this book now? And there are many reasons I'm writing the book now, as I described. But, part of me thought, should I only write this book if they fix the problem, right? No, but I do think there's a tendency to think, well, we had that initiative, we tried that, we can move on now, or we have to move on, or it didn't work. And you have to keep your foot on all of these gas pedals, if that's a terrible analogy, but you know what I mean. You can't just keep your eye on one statistic. I think it all matters. So, yeah.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
So you mentioned that MIT started giving maternity leave for faculty members, right? So we have the same thing at Georgia Tech, but we also have paternity leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
So both female faculty and male faculty get the same leave months or reduce work, modified active duty.
Yeah. Active duty, I like that.
Right.
Like your soldiers.
So how do you think that, well, the argument is that, well, nowadays we want both father and mother to be actively involved in the childcare, right? So change of culture at home, right? But then in the end, the pregnancy, breastfeeding, the responsibility of mother is not comparable to the father. So how do you think that we can change that culture?
So this is very loaded, which doesn't mean that I'm not going to answer it. I'm just, I was at University of Pennsylvania yesterday, and they were talking about how now the women's groups feel not under attack, but under pressure to not exclude trans women. And so it's like, I just feel like there's a lot of focus on identity, and so it's like, and who's being excluded and who's being included. So yes, I think if you say like, well, the men can't take paternity leave, it's like, well, that's exclusive. We don't want to replace one kind of exclusion with another. But what the women at MIT found was that, in fact, at the time there was family leave for men and women alike, but the women weren't taking it because there was a stigma around it. The men were taking it, but they were using it to start their companies or work on their companies, right? Which really, yes, we do want men to be involved parents. I think, maybe I'm not a university administrator, or a benefits administrator. I mean, I think one possible solution is to look at pregnancy and leave different ways, maybe weight the pregnancy a different way. I mean, I think there are solutions around all of these things, and again, we can't just give up because it's a hard problem, right? It's a challenge, and we like challenges. But I do think at MIT, one of the things they did was crack down on this idea of, you have to be, and I've seen this at other universities too, you have to be with your kids. Like, you can't be off doing something else. It can't be like, you can't have can't be paying for a nanny 10 hours a day and working on your side project. But the other thing, I think you have to look, one of the things that I think they did also, I think this was only in the School of Engineering, I'm not sure, but they looked at the benefits that people were getting. And as I mentioned, many of the women did not have children. One of the main benefits that MIT was providing was tuition reimbursement. Well, you weren't getting a benefit if you were a woman and didn't have children. That benefit was going to men. And interestingly, one of the things I told you about the Dean of Science, who was so moved by these women around this conference table, one of the reasons he was so moved was that none of them had children. He had 4 kids. And he just suddenly, listening to their stories, he was like, it had never occurred to him whether he had to choose to have children. He just did it because that's what everyone did. But he also had a wife at home. So anyway, but they had this problem with the benefits, and that the men were ultimately getting more money in benefits because they were getting tuition reimbursement. So I believe what they did was move to more of a cafeteria style of benefits, so that you could kind of customize your plan. So I think that's another thing that people can do, is kind of look at the benefits. In terms of, I struggle with this because like even just yesterday, I had the email from the teacher, and it's like, does it go to me and my husband? No, it goes to me. There's always like when they pick up the phone, they often call the mother. So I think that's a cultural change that goes beyond science and beyond academia, I think. But I do think there are structural things that the university can do to make sure that people are actually taking care of children when they are on maternity or family leave.
Hey,
Hi, Alex.
so I'm going to ask a question about using archives for research.
Yes.
I am hoping that you can speak a little bit to your experience using archives when you were researching the book.
Yeah. Well, it was hugely important, obviously, partly because I started reporting this book kind of in 2018 because I was writing a book proposal then, and then I sold the proposal in December of that year, and then fully started reporting in 2019. And then, of course, 2020, early in the year, things shut down. And so not only were archives important, but the ability to have digitized archives was hugely important. So this project actually got started, as you know, because this is the famous Alex, who I talked about earlier. Nancy Hopkins had retired from MIT and had this, she had a note, I'm nearly knocked my water. She had this shelf of notebooks full of all of her information from this. So she had her floor plans where she had measured and color-coded how much space she had, and she had all of her memos, and she had a diary, and she had her calendars, and every email that had gone back and forth between her and her space wars and her fight for this committee. So it first came up as actually an archival project. So that was enormous. Just when Nancy's a protege of James Watson, who, like Watson and Crick, and she falls in love with the study of DNA as a student at Radcliffe 4 months after, in a lecture taught by Jim Watson, 4 months after he and Francis Crick have won the Nobel Prize for their decoding the structure of DNA. Jim Watson remained a mentor to her, and when she started having problems, he said to her, you need to write this down. You need to keep a log of what's happening to you. So I had, part of her archives was this daily chronology of what was happening to her. So she would tell me something, and I would be able to check it against the chronology, and that was incredibly important, knowing who she had conversations with on what days. So it was really invaluable, the fact that they had emails, but then that's just the MIT side of it. Then I realized that there was, I know what I was looking for. There was a young editor on my book project, and she asked what should have been a really simple question, but I didn't know the answer. She said, how many women were in that first bio lecture that Nancy went to? Or she said, and I said, not many. And then I went and I looked at the numbers, but I had to do some digging to find the numbers. And I actually figured out that the way I could find it was in the Watson archives at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. So I called them, and they actually had no, that's not it, I'm sorry. I tried to find it that way. And in that, I actually ended up realizing how much there was about Nancy in the Watson archive, because every birthday card they'd exchanged, every letter, she writes him letters from graduate school. So again, her thinking about graduate school is all laid out there. And again, like even when she was doing papers later on, she would sometimes send them to Watson for him to review, and he would write back notes. So that was a huge part. Then, because I couldn't find the number of female students in the class at Cold Spring Harbor in the Watson archives, I went to the Radcliffe archives, and they said, okay, go to the Harvard archives and look up the course catalogs. And the Harvard and MIT in particular, but I think this is true of many universities, they keep records of everything. I think at Harvard it's a little dose of self-importance, but like literally, I mean, records of everything. So they had the number of Radcliffe students and Harvard students in each class. So I was able to figure out that actually the number of women in this class wasn't so low, and it reflected the percentage of women at Radcliffe. Again, it was male, two colleges, male, female at the time. Percentage of women at Radcliffe who were studying biology, which was about, I think it was like 17%, and there were roughly 17% female students in this class. That in itself led me to something else, led me to sort of another like thematic idea, which was that this group of women really was, so again, this was 1963, class of 1964. They were really a generation on the cusp because they're pre-women's movement. You know, if you think about the National Organization for Women as founded in 1967. So they didn't have the advantages of the women's movement, but they did have this they had Betty Friedan, and the Feminine Mystique came out in 1963. So I started looking into that generation. And so what I could find in the Radcliffe archives was records of what women were majoring in. And you could see that in the early 60s, the percentage of women who majored in history and English, which were the traditional sort of like good breeding majors, you know, I mean, I'm a history and English major, so I'm not going to knock it down, but the percentage of women going into science was suddenly, you know, women were suddenly thinking like, oh, I could do different things. So that was interesting to me. And then I was also able to find Nancy's 1964 yearbook. It was actually the last year that there was a separate Radcliffe yearbook, lucky for me, because the editors of the Radcliffe yearbook had written these essays that were fascinating about their own ambitions and their, you know, what they expected for their lives. And so, again, this generation on the cusp, it gave me a sense of who they were and what they were experiencing, and they talked about how, you know, Kennedy had been shot the previous November, and they talked about how he'd been seen in the stands at the Harvard-Yale game puffing on a cigar and wearing shade, you know, glasses like Joe Biden. So they had this great archive of sort of like the time, it described the time for me. But it was also, you know, they talked about Betty Friedan, and they said, oh, but that's for our mother's generation. Like, we don't need that. We don't need that. They fully expected to have careers, be able to raise families. They expected to be treated as equals to their male counterparts. They thought Harvard men were, you know, coming around to this idea of taking them seriously and treating them as equals. So, I mean, it was just, it's a rabbit hole, but it's so interesting. I mean, thank God I had the archives. And then, at the end, I really felt like I didn't have, particularly so these women, most of them, female faculty arrived in the 70s. So I had a good sense of the 60s and 70s, and then I thought, I don't really have a sense of MIT in the 80s and 90s. And by that point, you know, as you know, there's this oral history project for women from the 70s and 80s, and I was able to just go read these oral histories. Also I feel like I'm getting a lot of tangents here, but another interesting thing about this project was that there were, again, 16 women. Not all of them were thrilled about this project. Nancy quit on me the first day. I took a leave from the New York Times to write this book, and she quit on me the first day. She was so nervous about this. And then I coaxed her back. But there was one woman who didn't want to cooperate on the project because, she would cooperate. She wasn't sure she wanted to talk to me. Because she thought that I was going to make the men look too bad and that she would feel embarrassed to be around her male colleagues. Then there was another woman who was actually among the younger women in the group who had closed down her lab out of frustration in her early 60s, so premature retirement. And she didn't want to talk to me because she thought that I was going to make this too much of, you know, a puff piece or a happy story, and she felt like it's not a happy story. So that was kind of interesting. But I was able to, that's when I think, met you in person, because I was able to get, there had been these oral histories with her, or rather these videotaped histories with her. So that was incredibly important to me, because she was one of the only women who had children. So I was able to get, from her interview, I was able to get a better sense of what it was like for women with children. So enormously important, the archives. Yeah, you can keep your job.
Thank you for being here.
Of course.
So this is great for MIT,
Yeah,
but as we sit here today,
it's not
we
MIT.
three, are they still the exception? And where other universities' systems are working together?
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, are they the exception? No. If you look at the Ivy League, okay, so at the time when this happened, there was one female president in the Ivy League, Judith Rodin at Penn. We're now going to have, is it 6 or 7 starting in the fall? That's pretty striking. But in terms of female faculty, the numbers are still really low. I was actually struck, I think you had 42% at Georgia Tech, and maybe,
Yeah.
no, that's students.
No, it was 44%, but I think it was 31%.
Okay, yeah, so it's not, it's certainly
Okay.
not, again, it's not, it doesn't reflect the percentage of women on campuses, which is really striking. And I think other campuses would probably have, MIT, that number about, we have to wait till 2064 to have it look the same, MIT looks largely the same. I mean, it's going to be another 40 years. So I don't think they're the exception, but I think they look so they're the exception when it comes to female leadership. I think we don't yet see that. On the other hand, Harvard has its first black woman president, so that's pretty striking. But I have a friend who graduated from Harvard, 2 schools exactly. So it's So I was saying earlier, a friend of mine who graduated from Harvard in 1990 had not a single female professor. Striking, right? But then I think, I'm not even sure, I don't remember from my own college years. Like, I remember one person, but I wasn't keeping track of it at the time. But there probably weren't a lot, because I can't remember any. Harvard didn't tenure its, and I'm talking a lot about Harvard, and I think Georgia Tech falls into this category too. Like, the prestigious schools set the tone for everybody else. So Harvard didn't tenure its first woman in history until 1984. That's really kind of amazing if you think about that women were majoring in history for so long. So yes, I think that most universities have this same problem. I think the tenure clock is part of it, but I think the attitudes that we talked about earlier are a bigger problem. And I think that's why, to me, this whole issue of how we view women kind of crystallizes in science, because we do have this idea of science being a pure meritocracy and the place where you can get ahead just on intellect and hard work alone. And I think ultimately that it's proven not the case. It's really, science kind of shows us that it's still about how smart we think people are and how smart we think, what we think of women's capacity. There's this devastating line in the book where Charles Eliot, who's an early president he's the president of Harvard in the late 1800s, when these group of women come and say, we'd like to admit women to Harvard. And he says, we're not yet sure whether women have the intellect to live up to this. And ha ha ha, but that thinking actually kind of goes into the 2000s, If you think about Larry Summers, in 2005, Larry Summers was at a conference. What this episode at MIT did was raise consciousness around this issue. Tons of conferences on women in science and math. Larry Summers is speaking at one, Nancy Hopkins is there, and he says, the first thing he says is, well, one of the things that explains this is that women don't want to work 80-hour weeks. That's the first thing that upsets Nancy. And then he says, and there's, if you look at math scores, women lack the intrinsic aptitude for math at higher levels. Again, not true, but that's when Nancy gets up and walks out. She becomes sort of infamous for walking out on Larry Summers. But what I'm saying is, those attitudes persisted, and when I went back, again, talking about research for the book and the archives, when you go back and just look at the stories that were written around Larry Summers' comments, it's really interesting the number of people who came to his defense, including some women, saying well, he's just raising an idea, he's just raising a possibility. The reality is, research has shown us, that's just not true. It's not true. There's more difference among women and among men than there is between men and women on math scores. It's really not a matter of men being smarter than women. So
we have time for one more.
okay.
So I feel like as the director of the LGBT Center, I'd be remiss in not asking, you mentioned trans folks earlier, and I'm wondering what the future looks like for either the inclusion of trans women in women's initiatives, or if we're thinking like broader and gender equity work of the inclusion of trans women, non-binary folks, trans men, and their experiences and their representation, which you've talked about as being really important in the sciences, particularly when we look at youth. About 2% of all youth identify as trans in some way or another. And so I think it's a growing community, but not one that gets a lot of attention when we talk about gender equity initiatives or programs.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, this is one of those no person's land. It's hard because the groups are sort of atomized. But it's interesting that this comes just after I was talking about Larry Summers, because Nancy will say that when she spoke up against Larry Summers, no one stood up for her. Plenty of people were standing up for Larry Summers. But interestingly enough, there was a man named Ben Barris. Do you know Ben Barris? Do you know that name? Ben Barris stood up for Nancy. And Ben Barris was a neuroscientist, I believe. Again, died prematurely young. But he was a trans man who'd been a woman. And he tells this great story, not great, but funny, haha story, that he was presenting in a meeting and he overheard, or someone reported back later that someone had commented on his talk by saying, I heard this talk by Ben Barris, it was really amazing. You know, I saw his sister Barbara speak at an event a few years ago and she's not nearly as good. So again, like it's kind of a, like he's sort of a nice sample size. Yeah, I think that there are Ben Barris was the exception for sure. But I do think given that representation is important, you might want to look up his story. I think, I had this discussion with this woman at Penn yesterday, and I said, well, what are you doing to make yourself available? And I mean, at a certain level, I think that that's what we can expect. I'm actually curious what your answer would be. I mean, I think it's important to open up the groups and say that all are welcome and included, but do you think, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, do you think that that's enough or not enough? Like, what do you think can be done?
Yeah, I think a focus on like language is always important.
Yes,
so,
yep.
you know, saying that this is a group for those who experience like gender marginalization.
Yep.
I also think like names and pronouns are important.
Yep.
Moving away from like male-female language and switching to man-woman, non-binary. And so like
on the man-woman thing, also this is where like it runs up against the New York Times style book. So people are like, why are you using the word female? So grammatically, female is the adjective and woman is the noun. So like but again, like up until 2-3 years ago, we didn't capitalize black. So language can change, and I think that is really important. You're right. You raise a really good point. Yeah. And that's kind of what I said to her yesterday, was I think like it is a lot about language and how you talk to people. Even when I was writing this book, I have a note in the front about language because there were so many men named. I wanted to use first names because that's what people do in labs, and also I had known Nancy for 20 years at this point, so I wasn't going to call her Hopkins or Dr. Hopkins. But then I had a problem because there were so many Davids and so many Bobs. I couldn't even say like Bob B because there were 2 Bob Bs. So I used last names for men, but I didn't want it to fall into that thing of like, taking men more seriously because we give them the last name. It has more heft. So I had to put a note in about that, and it's really interesting to see how language changes. Another example of that is secretaries, as they identified themselves at the time. Now we would probably say executive assistants or administrative assistants. They play a really important role in. They're often the ones who could spot what was the way these women were being treated, the discrepancies, and so. In one case, a secretary, or they can head off bad behavior. So yeah, it was really interesting. In one case, Nancy's, in her fight for tenure, Nancy's #1 ranked by her department for tenure, and then a powerful man comes in and makes her #2, and that guy's secretary goes to the ombudsperson, or at the time ombudsman, and complained about this, which I thought was interesting. So, yeah. So I do think language is very important, but I also think. I had a similar conversation with the woman who's the head of the Students for Women in Engineering at Penn, because she was saying that they had done a recruiting fair, and someone said to her, well, why are you excluding the men? And I said, well, are you excluding the men? And she said, no, in fact, there was a young man wandering around talking to the companies. So yeah, I think you can make it clear that all are welcome. I think that's powerful.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to get ready to transition to our community conversation.
Oh, okay.
So with that, Kate, do you have any last words you want to leave us as we make that transition?
Well, okay, so I'll do 2 stories that have been, as I said, I'm wrapping up like 4 weeks of this. So I'll do 2 stories that that people like. One is about my son, and one is about this question of language, right? I was writing this book in 2020 when most of us had to go into our homes and stay there. So everyone's looking for movies to watch. And I was writing a book about MIT, so I was like, what movie haven't we seen? Oh, we haven't seen Good Will Hunting, which is like the perfect Boston movie, perfect MIT movie. So we're watching it, and we come to that scene where, Will, the janitor, is swabbing the floor, and he sees this really, really difficult, almost impossible to solve equation on the board, and he goes over and he solves it. And my son, who had just turned 13, is watching this, and he goes, wow. He's Nancy smart. So that is one thing. Like, you can change your language, and we can start with the next generation. I'm not sure he would say that now, but I like to think that I'm working on him. And then the second thing I will say is, again, also about language. And I don't want to make it sound like, I don't want to be flip and make it sound like it's just about how you talk. But these are both examples of that. Another story I like to tell is that one of the first things people notice about Nancy Hopkins is she has a slight British accent. And so people are always trying to place her. And they're like, oh, is it Long Island Lockjaw? Is it mainline Philadelphia? Is she British? It's because she grew up in New York City, but she had an English grandmother who lived in her building, and she spent a lot of time with her. So a couple years ago, when I first started talking to Nancy about the book, we were talking almost every day, and I noticed that she used the word brilliant a lot. And I thought it was the way British people do, like, oh, the soup is brilliant, and that's a brilliant idea. And so I asked her about it, and she said, no. She said, I just started noticing a few years ago that nobody ever calls the women brilliant. So I just decided when they were brilliant, I was going to start pointing it out. So I was doing this bookstore event in the town where I live now, and I was like, we just went around the room and like, and you're brilliant, and you're brilliant, and you're brilliant. So I encourage you to go out and like notice the brilliance in people, notice the brilliance in the women in your life, and celebrate that. So I guess that would be my trite words of wisdom to finish the evening.
I love that. Well, if you can join me and give a hand clap for Kate tonight. Thank you so much. And we're going to get instructions from Catherine.
So I'm going to change it up a little bit.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, so we have got some refreshments upstairs, and after this, we will go and we'll just have community conversations upstairs with the refreshments.
Nice.
And I'm forgetting something. Oh, you all have books, and we have the author here. She's got a Sharpie. So during this, you can get your book signed as well. And we've got a few Georgia Tech people around that can help facilitate some of these community conversations while we eat some snacks. Thank you for coming. My name is Catherine Mancy. I'm the public programming librarian here. My pronouns are she, her. I really appreciate you coming. I hope you'll join us for future events here at the library. And we will guide people up to the second floor. We're going to be in the Scholars Event Network. So if you kind of look right upstairs and behind us, that's where we have refreshments set out. Thanks for coming.